Facebook's at the bottom of the second page.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. This is a lot of fun, I think. I enjoy going through this, and I hope you're enjoying it as well. I have a lot that I want to cover today, and I don't know that I'll get it all done, but I'm gonna try. I want to do this whole chapter 25, but then there's a different topic I want to spend a few minutes on at the very end if we have time. So would you please turn to Acts chapter 25. Now just a recap, remember that Paul had been brought under military escort from Jerusalem to Caesarea, and then a contingent from the Sanhedrin were sent to Caesarea to bring charges against Paul. And the governor, Felix, I think he kind of knew that this was phony stuff, and if anything, it was all religious stuff that didn't have anything to do with his part in Rome. But he wanted to do a favor for the Jews. And remember, extra biblical history, there had been a riot between Gentiles and Jews in the city of Caesarea, and then some of the Jews, they didn't stand down, and so Felix marched his troops in there and really beat them down. So there's bad feeling toward Felix, so that might help explain why Felix wanted to do the Jews a favor, so he left Paul in prison for those 2 years. And then remember, it also said he was hoping Paul would give a bribe. So he must have heard about and known about the big offerings that Paul and his friends brought to the church of Jerusalem. So he figures Paul has a lot of money, or the church has a lot of money, and they're going to bribe him. And of course, Paul never did that. But then finally we saw that Felix was replaced as governor by Porcius Festus. So that's what we pick up with in chapter 25. So if you follow with me there. Now 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. So he's on the job 3 days, and he's smart enough to know that if he's going to govern this province, he's got to get to know the leaders in Jerusalem. So he goes to visit Jerusalem. And this is 2 years. Remember, Paul has been in prison, in kind of house arrest in Caesarea for 2 years. And now in verse 2 here, and the chief priests and the principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul. So Festus shows up and says, hey, I'm the new governor, and let's talk about, how things are. And they go, well, we got a problem. You've got a guy in jail up there. We can't say, that's like their big issue, right? And they urged him, asking as a favor against Paul that he summon him to Jerusalem, because they were planning an ambush to kill him on the way. Remember when Paul was in prison in the Antonia fortress out at the edge of the Temple Mount, and they brought him to the Sanhedrin to speak the first day, and then the second day they were going to bring him again, and Paul's nephew found out that 40 men had vowed not to eat food until they had killed Paul, and they were going to ambush him the next day when he came to the Sanhedrin. That's why the tribune sent him under military escort. So here it is 2 years later, so those 40 guys must be really hungry. Yeah. Verse 4, Festus replied that Paul was being kept at Caesarea, that he himself intended to go there shortly. So said he, let the men of authority among you go down with me, and if there's anything wrong about the man, let them bring charges against him. So whether Festus could sort of tell that they were not sincere, or if this is just a blind luck, or maybe it's, evidence of the Lord protecting Paul, but he says, no, I'm not going to send him to Jerusalem. You guys come to Caesarea. I'm going back there. You can bring charges. Yeah. So verse 6, after he stayed among them not more than 8 or 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. And the next day he took his seat on the tribunal. So the seat is very important. When you're sitting on the chair, that's when you can make judgments. There was one governor, not this one, but the story is that he used to have his chair brought around with him in his baggage. So wherever he went, if there was a case he had to try, he could get the chair and be the judge. So it's a big deal. Verse 7, when he had arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him, that's against Paul, that they could not prove. Paul argued in his defense, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense. Now, he denies offenses in 3 areas there. What does that tell us? That tells us what were the 3 areas that the Jews were charging him, right? But these are the things he's defending himself from. So now we know what the Jews were saying that he did, that he had offended, he'd broken the laws of the Jews, he had broken the laws of the temple, and that he had sinned or committed offenses against Caesar. Now that's going to be important. Verse 9. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me? In other words, Festus has to be sure that he's protecting Paul because Paul's a Roman citizen. But he also wants to do the Jews a favor, just like Felix did. So now he's saying, okay, well, you want to go... In other words, this is stuff about Jewish law. It's about the temple. And we're in Caesarea. Why don't you go back to Jerusalem and let's do the trial there, and then you can handle it. But look at how Paul's answer, verse 10. But Paul said, I am standing before Caesar's tribunal where I ought to be tried. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourself know very well. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But if there is nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with his council, answered, to Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go. So remember the 3 different kinds of charges leveled against Paul. He says, the stuff with the Jews, I haven't done anything against them. But the big thing here is they're charging me with offending somehow Caesar. And so then I have to be judged by Caesar. You see what? The Jews stepped into a trap by claiming that he violated something against Caesar's government. They thought that's going to get Paul in even more trouble, and the governor is going to be more disfavorable toward Paul. But instead, what's happened now? By charging that he violated something against Caesar, only Caesar now has the authority to make that decision. So Paul appeals to Caesar, and that was part of Roman law. You could always appeal to Caesar if you were accused of something. And so now Festus has to send him to Caesar. How do you think Festus feels about that? He's glad, right? Yeah, he's off the hook. And we're going to see that in the next section here. So verse 13. Now when some days had passed, Agrippa the king and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and greeted Festus. And as they stayed there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, there is a man left prisoner by Felix, and when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews laid out their case against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I answered them that it was not the custom of the Romans to give up anyone before the accused met the accusers face to face and had opportunity to make his defense concerning the charge laid against him. So when they came together here, I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought. When the accusers stood up, they brought no charge in his case of such evils as I supposed. Rather, they had certain points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Being at a loss how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wanted to go to Jerusalem and be tried there regarding them. But when Paul had appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of the emperor, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I'd like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, said he, you will hear him. Okay, so the new governor gets a visit by King Herod Agrippa II. All right, who is King Herod Agrippa II? Well,
Herod's son.
Herod Agrippa the first son. But just remember the Herod family. So there was Herod the Great. That was the one that was in charge of everything when Jesus was born. Remember? He killed the little babies because he wanted to kill Jesus. Herod the Great was a great builder. Herod the Great built the city of Caesarea. He built Masada. He built the temple. He built fortresses all over the place. In some ways, he was a very powerful leader, but he was also paranoid. He was always afraid that someone was going to take his throne from him, so he actually had various members of his own family assassinated. So when he died, 3 of his sons split up part of his kingdom. So they put a Roman governor in charge of Judea. So the Roman governor at the time of Jesus' ministry was Pontius Pilate, right. And you hear about Jesus talking about Herod in the Gospels, right? But that's not Herod the Great. He's been long dead. That's his son, Herod Antipas. And you remember John the Baptist accused Herod Antipas of sinning because Herod's brother, Philip, married, oh boy, like a half-sister or something, Herodias. And then she divorced Philip in order to marry Herod Antipas, and that's, remember, John the Baptist was accusing him of sin. That's why John the Baptist lost his head. But they had split up the northern part of the kingdom, Trachonitis and Galilee, and we forget the third part. And those were 3 other sons of Herod that took those parts. There was also one of Herod's sons, Aristobulus, one of the sons that Herod thought maybe was going to try to take the throne from him. So he had his own son killed, Aristobulus. So Herod Agrippa the first was the son of Aristobulus. So as soon as his father was killed, his mother took him to Rome. So he grew up in Rome, and he was friends with the guy that would eventually become Caesar, Caesar Gaius. So when his friend becomes Caesar, he gives Herod Agrippa the first part of the kingdom again. So I don't think it was Judea, but I think it was the northern parts of the kingdom. And then eventually it did include Judea again. It all gets very confusing. So Herod Agrippa was the king. And Herod Agrippa is mentioned earlier in the book of Acts. We've run into him before. And Herod Agrippa's mother was Jewish. So Herod Agrippa became Jewish as well, or at least kind of practiced being Jewish. And because of that, the Jews accepted him. The Jews never liked Herod the Great, but Herod Agrippa, they did like him. And you remember from last week, Herod Agrippa had a younger daughter who was very, very beautiful. Do you remember her? That was Drusilla. And Drusilla married Governor Felix. So that's why we ran into them in the last meeting. Okay, now, this is Herod Agrippa II. So when Herod Agrippa I died, Herod Agrippa II was really young, like 17 years old. So they didn't make him the king. But then sometime later, then Caesar did give him, again, part of the kingdom, and then gave him another part later on. So this Herod Agrippa II, son of Herod Agrippa I, he is a king. And Drusilla is his younger sister. And who is Bernice then? Well, who do you think Bernice would be?
His sister.
Sounds like his wife, doesn't it? But it's his sister. Yes. So Bernice is the older sister of Drusilla, the sister of Herod Agrippa II. So Herod Agrippa II never married, never had any kids. Bernice was given in marriage to somebody, and then he died, and she went to live with her brother, and then she was married to another one, her uncle, Herod Agrippa I's brother or something like that. and then she didn't like him. No, that was the first marriage. The second marriage was to the king of Cilicia, and she didn't like him, so she left him and moved back in with her brother. So there were lots of rumors that brother and sister were living incestuously. We'll never know if that was true. And talk about, Peyton Place has nothing on the Herod family, right? But Agrippa II, like his father, Agrippa I, then lived as a practicing Jew. So he knew a lot about the Jewish faith. And he would, of course, known a lot then about this Christian sect within the Jewish faith. So Agrippa and Bernice come to visit the new governor. It's kind of like paying all your social calls when you're high up there, right? And so they come to visit Festus, and Festus tells them this whole story of Paul. Why does Festus tell them this story all about Paul? Well, he's got to send Paul back to Caesar, but he also has to send a report. He has to tell Caesar, this is why I'm sending this guy to you. This is what he says, this is what's happened. And Festus doesn't understand any of this stuff. They're talking about the temple and Jewish laws, and his head is spinning. But Agrippa comes to visit me, and Agrippa knows all this stuff. So he tells Agrippa, and then now Agrippa can help him with this letter, give him information that he needs for the letter that he's going to send to Caesar. So you see how this is all coming together here? So they talk about him, and what does Agrippa say? Oh, I'd love to hear Paul for myself. He knows something about the Christian faith, and he knows a lot about the Jewish faith, and so this is all interesting to him. So let's pick up at verse 23. So on the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp. So they're coming in, right, with all the drapes hanging from themselves, right? And they entered the audience hall with the military tribunes. So according to Josephus, there were 5 auxiliary cohorts at Caesarea. So I think we talked about this in another Sunday school class a long time ago. Rome had its various legions, and they were assigned to different places, but then there were auxiliary legions that were part of the Roman army, but they weren't necessarily Romans. They were drawn from local people. I think Mike was the one that got me started researching this when he mentioned, because in the story of Jesus and the centurion, very likely that centurion was not a Roman centurion. He may have been even a Jewish centurion who had joined the auxiliary army, or from Galilee or something like that. So 5 military tribunes. So imagine this is like big generals, right? And the prominent men of the city. So this is like a big thing. Now it's not a trial, it's just a hearing. It's a chance for them to talk about this. But all the big shots come to hear this. Now what might be part of the reason that Luke is telling us these details of the story? It's to show us, I think, that the message of the gospel is being presented to the seats of power. In other words, he's on his way to Rome. Eventually, he's going to be bearing witness to Caesar himself. That's kind of the thrust of the second half of the book, isn't it? It's like God is making sure that this message of Christ is going to the whole world, including to the very tops of the seats of power. Now, remember what Paul, we aren't going to look it up, but remember what Paul says in the book of Corinthians. He's talking to Corinthians. He says, now remember, not many of you were powerful, not many of you were rich. In other words, the gospel, by the powerful people in the world, the gospel is usually rejected, right? Who are the people that usually receive the gospel? People like us, average people, right? Normal people. People of power and pomp and circumstance, they don't need it. But not always. Sometimes. And so Luke tries to call that out, and he calls attention to it when there are prominent people that do receive the gospel. I think back on go ahead, Pastor.
I just, Agrippa wanted to meet Paul, we just talk about that and hear what he had to say. And so I was just thinking of Herod. Pontius Pilate sent Jesus to Herod. Herod said, I long to see this man and hear him, referring to Jesus. So we've been talking about, Paul.
The parallels.
Parallels between
Yes.
Jesus and Paul, and it happens again.
I had not thought about that, but that's right on target. Yes, I wish I had caught that too. Another one of the parallels with the story of Jesus. Herod asking to see or hear him.
You get a job as a pastor.
I could.
Well, I remember my years in the Navy, and I had somebody tell me this. This was when I was still a teenager, and I went to a Christian meeting somewhere, and there was a man that I did not know, never saw him before, and never seen him since. But I went up for prayer afterwards. They invited, who wants to come up and have prayer? I always took advantage of that. Yeah, someone could pray for me? Yeah. So I went up there and he prayed for me, and he looked at me and he said, you will bear witness to Christ all around the world. And how did he know that? I don't know. But I joined the Navy and I bore witness to Christ all around the world. And it was like, I hadn't been in the Navy very long. I probably told this story before. I was still brand new. I'd just gotten to my first duty station in Hawaii. And I barely, had my feet dry, and I got a call, and it was a veteran, a Marine Corps veteran whose wife had died of cancer. He was looking for a Navy chaplain to do the service, and so we volunteer for that. We have to, help out active duty. We don't have to help the veterans, but we always try to if we can. And I said, of course I would do that. So I met with him and with his sons, and he was very pleased with the service I did, very thankful to me. And I did the service, and we did it at the, I can't remember, the big veteran cemetery. It's up in like a old volcano crater in Hawaii, really beautiful place.
Punch Bowl?
The Punch Bowl, yeah, thank you. And there probably weren't more than 15 people there, probably 15 people, very small. But I preached the gospel. I still remember to this day, some of the illustrations I used, because that was my first one in the Navy, so I remember doing it. It was all done and everybody left. And the funeral director comes up to me and says, wow, bet you don't get to do that every day. I think he's talking about the funeral. I discovered what it was. The governor of Hawaii was one of those 15 people, Ben Cayetano. And the woman who died, she was the secretary of the governor. So he came for her funeral. So I preached the gospel to the governor. Now, I didn't know, not always preaching, but at least with prayers, being asked to pray, I prayed for events. And one day I remember trying to sit down and I thought, I'm going to think about this. How many congressmen I've prayed in front of? How many 4-star admirals and 4-star generals and people on the president's staff? And because it was all, when you add it all up, it was a lot.
Yeah.
And so I still look back on that as, I'm happy to be here just with us plain old folks. This is good for me. But I had that season in my life where the Lord sent me out there to preach and bring his word to the people in high seats of power. And I think that's part of what we're observing here with Paul. It's the Lord making sure that the word goes out to the small and to the great.
I bet you wish you could preach to your governor now.
Yeah, right. Verse 24, Festus said, King Agrippa and all who are present with us, you see this man about whom the whole Jewish people petitioned me, both in Jerusalem and here, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. But I found that he had done nothing deserving death, and as he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to go ahead and send him. But I have nothing definite to write to my lord about him. Now, see, there it is again, what I said before. He's got to write something to Caesar when he sends him. He doesn't know what to say. So that's why he's hoping Agrippa can help him, and then all this will be helpful. Therefore I brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after we have examined him, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable in sending a prisoner not to indicate the charges against him. So you see, this whole thing's been what it's all been set up for. And Paul now is going to have an opportunity to bear witness to kings and governors and generals. It's going to be a big deal. Okay, we have, is that clock correct? about 12 minutes? All right, so we got through a chapter today. That's never happened before.
I was gonna bet
Lord
against
works in
that.
mysterious ways.
If you can stay with me for 10 more minutes, I wanted to just shift gears here a little bit, just to talk about something that's in the news, because I think it's important for us to have a biblical and Christian perspective on it. And that is the war that's going on in Israel right now. And so I'd like to invite you to just look up some passages very quickly. Is that okay? All right, so let's go to Jeremiah 31. Jeremiah 31. Very famous, very important chapter. The promise here of the gospel God was going to give to us. And go to verse 35. Verse 35. Verse 35. All right, thus says the Lord, who gives the sun for light by day, and the fixed order of the moon and the stars for light by night, who stirs up the sea so that its waves roar. The Lord of hosts is his name. This is what God says. If this fixed order departs from before me, declares the Lord, then shall the offspring of Israel cease from being a nation before me forever. All right, so God, we know the story of how God chose Abraham and Abraham's son Isaac and Isaac's son Jacob, and the descendants of Jacob were the Israelites, and God gave to the Israelites in the Old Testament the promised land. And there are many Christians today, and I'll just in the nature of transparency and honesty, I think most Lutherans are in this camp that believe that the promises God made to them now belong to the spiritual children of Abraham. So the New Testament explains that the spiritual children of Abraham are those who have faith. So you may or may not be Jewish by bloodline. You probably are Gentiles by your bloodline, but you're children of Abraham and you're recipients of the promises to Abraham because you have the same faith that Abraham had. But then the question becomes, well, what happens to the original people of Abraham? That's what we would call today Jewish people who are descended from Jacob. And most people, I think, and I think most Lutherans would say, well, God is in one sense done with them. They're now, the train has passed them. And the only thing that matters is if they come to faith, and then they're children of Abraham spiritually. But physically, there's nothing more that God has to do with them. I don't believe that. Now, to be saved, to go to heaven, they still have to have faith in Jesus Christ. You can't be saved by being a good Jew. Everyone has to have faith in Jesus Christ. But does God still have a plan for them in the unfolding of history? There's something that God is doing with the nations and the way that he interacts with the world in which they play a part. Well, look at what he says here. If this fixed order departs from me, then the offspring of Israel will cease to be a nation. In other words, if there's no more sun, no more moon, no more seas, then Israel's not a nation anymore in my sight. But as long as those things last, they are a nation before him. So God still has a purpose and a plan for Israel today. Now think about it. How many nations are there today that were nations 2,000 years ago?
Zero.
Yeah, that might not be zero, I don't know, but I think it's got to be close to zero, right? Where's the Ammonites? They're gone. Where's the Canaanites? They're gone. Where's the Hittites? They're gone. Where's the Babylonians? They're gone. How about the Egyptians? today's Egyptians are not descendants of ancient Egyptians. You know that, right?
No.
There were
know that.
Muslim waves that swept in there of different people groups that displaced the original Egyptians. The Romans, where's the ancient Romans? The Italians are all proud, we're descendants of the Romans. Oh, no, they're not. But they're still Jews. And they're still in Israel 2,000 years later. How can that be?
Didn't Israel stop being a nation though? I mean,
Oh, yeah.
So they didn't have a state,
State, country.
but they persevered as a people for 2,000 years, which to me makes it all the more miraculous that they held on to a national identity without a nation from 70 AD to 1948. That's incredible that Jews throughout the world, in Russia and in Ethiopia and in Yemen and Germany, still held on to their Jewish character and their Jewish nature. And now, 1900 years later, God reestablishes a Jewish state in 1948. So let me just go over, there's another verse I'd like to look at, but well, let's look at it. Romans 11. Romans 11. I don't have near enough time to go through the whole chapter with you the way it ought to be. But if you will, just bear with me. Let's pick up at verse 24. And Romans 11, starting at 24. Paul has been using here an analogy of an olive tree, and the original branches of the olive tree are identified with the Jews. And Paul is saying because they had unbelief, because they refused to believe in Christ, those branches were cut off. And you are wild olive branches, because you aren't part of the original nation of Israel, the called people. But God, because of your faith, has grafted you into the tree. So you're now part of the tree by faith. But look what he says starting in verse 24. For if you were cut from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back into their own olive tree? In other words, it's God's readiness to bring them back if they will come to faith. In other words, is God done with them? It doesn't sound like it. In fact, it gets even stronger. Look at verse 25. Lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. So he calls it a mystery. It means not everyone's going to understand it, right? A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, and in this way all Israel will be saved. In other words, why did the Jews not believe in Jesus Christ? God hardened their hearts and blocked their vision on purpose so that you, the Gentiles, could be brought to faith. And that God has a plan in the unfolding of history one day to bring many of them back to faith too. And then all Israel will be saved. All Israel now refers to natural Israel and spiritual Israel. Okay, now you can disagree with me theologically if you want to. We won't part fellowship over that. Most Lutherans probably do. But I'll call attention to just a few things about the state of Israel. There have been Jews living in Israel ever since the time that they took the Promised Land. So there were Jews living there 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 500 years. There have always been Jews living in Israel. But it was especially in the late 1800s that what was called the Zionist movement took root. The idea that there should be a Jewish homeland because everywhere in the world Jews were persecuted. If you ever go to, I think it's in Tel Aviv, they have the museum, there's a museum there which chronicles all the ways that Jews have been persecuted in the last couple thousand years. It was terrible. in every country. You watch Fiddler on the Roof. Watch it. That's not a true story, but it's a real life story. That happened again and again and again. And not just where they kicked out their land and everything stolen from them. Their synagogues would be burned. Sometimes they would be killed. And so they started to realize the only way that we can be safe in the world is if we have our own land. And so what was their land? The land where some of them have lived for practically forever. And so the idea said, let's go back to our own land. There was no such thing as Palestine back then. That was the Ottoman Empire. And so when the World War I ended, the British took control over that land that was controlled by the Ottoman Empire, and the British started encouraging Jews to move there, partly because I think British people of good heart knew that the Jews needed their own homeland, partly because there were prejudices against the Jews there too, and they just wanted to get rid of them. Let's send them here. So Jews started moving back there. After World War II, the United Nations, now the Jews were there and they wanted their own country, and so they were actually getting mad at the British that they couldn't have their own country. But there were also Arabs living there, and that's when they started to think, hey, we could have our own country here too. We'll call it Palestine. So after World War II, the United Nations came up with a partition plan. Okay, let's have two countries here. Palestine, an Arab country, and Israel, the Jewish nation. And the Jews said, fine, that sounds great to us. The Palestinians said, no, we want it all. And all the Arab countries around them agreed. And so the nation of Israel was started in 1948, May 14th. And the very next day, the day after they were declared a country, 5 Arab countries attacked them. They launched attacks with their armies. It's been called a great miracle, really. You've got a ragtag group of people, they've been a country for one day, they're not organized, and guess who won that fight? The Jews won. And they not only won, but they expanded their territory then. They were able to get more land because of all of this. I just can't go through all the history. There's so much here. But the whole history of the state of Israel has always been that the Arabs and the Palestinians refuse to allow them to have their own country. And the Jews would be perfectly comfortable with letting there be a Palestinian country as long as they could be at peace. And it's the Palestinians who have not allowed that. So there have been a series of wars. Hamas took... Gaza, I don't mean to go late. Can I go a couple more minutes?
Yeah.
Gaza was voluntarily given up by Israel in order to allow the Palestinians to have their own country. There were Jews living in Gaza. The Israelis went in and forced their own people to give up their own homes until they made them leave and give up everything they had, because they said, we're giving this area to the Palestinians. And ever since then, though, Gaza has been a thorn in their side. The Hamas took over as the governing political party in Gaza in 2007. Since 2007, Gaza and Israel have had 5 wars because Hamas does not allow free elections anymore. Once they took charge, and they are in charge, and you can't resist them. And they believe that they have to take everything. If you see these signs in the protests from the river to the sea, have you ever seen that? What does that mean? So here's the Jordan River, and here's the Mediterranean Sea. In other words, what are they saying? Palestine has to be this. Where's Israel go? No Israel. They want no Israel. Now, that's not to say the Israelites do everything perfectly.
Yeah.
There are Jews, there are Arabs that are citizens of the state of Israel. They live in Israel. They're definitely second-class citizens. They're treated kind of badly sometimes. And they'll for solidarity's sake, they'll rail against the Jews. but they live, their lifestyles, their incomes, their ways of life are definitely better than in the Palestinian state. They do way better. And some of them, you can become a judge if you're an Arab. You can get onto the Knesset. There's Arabs in the Knesset. They have much more rights and freedoms than they would under a Palestinian state. So when you watch all this going on, don't get confused by some of the rhetoric. There's hateful, just terrible demonic animosity against Israel. Why? Because God has a plan for Israel. And just like the devil wants to destroy marriage, right? Because marriage reminds him of Christ and the church. The devil wants to destroy Israel because it reminds him of God's plans and God's promises that he keeps. I wish we had more time to go over some of that, but I thought because it's very timely and it's in the news right now, I just wanted to remind you as my brothers and sisters in Christ, that when we hear this, don't let someone fool us. You'll hear them say, oh, Israel's apartheid and Israel's occupied. Almost all that stuff is false. It's based on the premise that none of that land should even be Israel in the first place. So be conscious of that. All right, thank you. Sorry for appreciate you letting me rail on and on.
We'll let you slide.
Lutherans that are spiritual Israel only, how do they justify this war against them?
But it's really the opposite. They're the ones.
I think they probably approach it the way they would any other war. They recognize that there is moral wrong on whichever side is committing this moral wrong. So they would, I think the average Lutheran would say, yeah, cutting off baby heads and stuff, starting wars against civilians, well, that's wrong. They would do that no matter who the countries are. But they don't see anything spiritual behind it in terms of what God is doing in the future. Does that make sense?
So do you think that God allows all of this so then more Jews will come to the full faith?
God's still got their side. You've got to be. Every time they're.